I have to make this joke again. I know we're recording, but toxic culture. I've had 2 glasses of wine, so intoxicated culture. Here we go, right? So I'm Franck, and I'm from Denmark originally, in case you spotted an accent. I'm from Copenhagen, came to Australia 22 years ago. I lived in India for a little while as well, and I've always had an interest and a passion for culture in terms of, in a broad sense, but also obviously in a company sense, right? Now, the reason why I really got interested in this topic area of toxic culture was because I had a conversation with a few of my friends, not too dissimilar to what we are doing here tonight. We were sitting around like dinner table, and a few of them, they work for really high profile organizations, corporate organizations in Australia. And the amount of grief that came out on the table in terms of how hard they felt it was to work for this particular organization they were working for, even though some of them were on the exec team of that particular organization. They were sort of saying, it's so hard, I really hate it, the way I'm being treated by colleagues and so on. And I just think, hang on, what's going on here? Right? Is it because, I mean, I know we're talking as friends here, but when I kind of read all the glossy sort of brochures and so on, and when I go on LinkedIn, it looks very it looks fabulous, right? All the people, they have smiles on their faces and they're celebrating, and so there's a disconnect somewhere. Anyway, so that made me, first of all, write an article. I've got a passion for music, so particularly 80s music. And the article I wrote was called, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? by Culture Club, right? So, and I guess this kind of, and that was on the back of my experience with my friends. But having said that, I've also just been through a big integration between Agile and O Media. And I've done previously the integration between 3 Mobile and Vodafone when we merged. So I've got a lot of experience around kind of bringing cultures together. And also to accelerate startups, like 3 Mobile was a startup in Australia, if you like, or turn things around. So when the Vodafone network collapsed in Australia, I was there to help to do the turnaround, right? And actually get our people installed, kind of rejuvenated and so forth. So I kind of experienced the various, I guess, phases of a company's evolution, through the good times, the bad times, and so forth. And it always comes back to the same thing. How can we preserve a healthy culture through the good times and through the tough times, right? That's the thing. So what I'm going to take you through here is not the gospel, it's just my experience, right? So obviously feel free to challenge, and feel free to think of it through the lens of your experience as well. But this is kind of my journey, if you like. I will ask you a few questions along the way, so there's no such thing as a free ride, right? So have a pen ready and be prepared to talk, even though it may not go on the podcast. I'm sure your person next to you wants to hear from you. So with that in mind, hello partner, look at the person next to you and say hello. Okay, all right. Now, we're going to start with a very short and very simple activity, and that is, what are your company's values? So the company that you work for now, write the values, the company values down on a piece of paper right now. And hopefully it won't be too hard a task for you to do. So as my kid normally says, are we there yet? Yeah? We're done? Yeah. Okay, cool, excellent. Now, values quiz. I'm putting 4 values up on the board here. The first one is respect. The second one is integrity. The third one is communication, and the fourth one is excellence. All right, turn to your partner again and determine which company am I talking about. Based on these values, a company have these values as their values. Which company is it? Okay, so this is where you look at your partner and you do engage. So, had it been Eddie Maguire, he would say log it in. So log it in. Any takers on which company we're talking about? Qantas? Qantas? Yeah? Okay, what else? Vodafone. Oh no, okay. All right, okay. It's interesting though, we have 2 contenders. Third one? We went with O. Oh, all companies, yeah, okay, all companies, okay. That's a good call out. So let me, we get back to this in a second, but let me share with you the company that we're talking about here. The company we're talking about here is this company. It's called Enron. Does anyone know about Enron? Yeah? Okay, so just to make it kind of really clear and concise, Enron is known for a few different things. One was, when you walked into the foyer at Enron, you would see 4 values: respect, integrity, communication, and excellence in the foyer, right? Beaming at you. What we also know is that Enron is notorious, became a case study as a corporate, I guess, dysfunctional giant, which basically was a utility company that basically engaged in fraudulent activity, insider trading, dodgy accounting, and so forth, right? So, and on the back of that, some tragic things happened. First of all, the company basically tanked and went out of business. And secondly, the people who were involved, the key leaders that were involved in this, they all had a pretty hard destiny, right? One committed suicide, one had a heart attack, and a few of them were imprisoned. So not really a good story, okay? So when you think about culture, we often think about, okay, what's the values of the organization? Now, if the values of the organization at Enron were as respect, integrity, communication, excellence, we have a bit of a disconnect here, haven't we? Because really, when we did the kind of, when the kind of synopsis was done and you actually dissected the company afterwards and looked at what really happened inside of Enron, what they found was the actual things that were going on, the operating values were actually arrogance, greed, competition and power, completely at odds with the values of the organization. So I often say, and this is a bit prerogative, I often say that your values are not your values, right? And I think that sometimes can be an important lesson just to think about, is because sometimes we think, okay, what's your company's values? Yeah, they're here, right? But is that really your values? Enron is an extreme case, I know. But I think it's an important thing when we talk about toxic culture to really understand the difference between the two, because having values versus what's going on are two different things. I call it the real deal. What's the real deal? Don't give me the induction, right? Give me the real deal. What are the real values, right? So let's take it from Enron in the US, bring it back to Australia. And I'm showing you a little slide here. It says, "Hello, Australia." And on here, we got some nice clippings from the recent issues around the Banking Royal Commission, as well as obviously some of the Royal Commission associated with aged care. And obviously what came out was quite disturbing, right? So once again, we saw certain things or certain behaviors, if you like, that you think that is pretty toxic. That is pretty toxic. It's not to say that the whole organization is toxic, but there certainly are something that's not right that needs to be addressed, right? I think we can all agree on that. And I'm sure, and this becomes the interesting point here, is that if we all look in our own organization that we work for, there probably are elements of toxicity, right? We just don't have to go through a Royal Commission. But being completely honest with ourselves and the organization is that there often is what I call a shadow side to the organization. And that shadow side can either be within a team, it can be within a function, it can be within a division, or it can be completely, basically all-encompassing the whole organization. But toxicity exists, I'm sure. It will exist in some way. It's just understanding how deep it is and where it is. And I think that's for me anyway, was the key things I thought about when this whole Royal Commission was sort of rolling through, in terms of where in my organization, with that show, where have we got toxicity? Because we had it as well, of course. No one's perfect. So your company, the values are not your values, all right? So that's an important thing when we start to really think about culture and particularly understanding toxic culture. There is this gap between what I call the espoused values versus the lived values, right? And they're not necessarily the same thing. They don't necessarily have to be at odds, but there might be something that is more valuable than your values. It could be just money, right? It could be risk aversion. So something could be more valuable than your values. And so just have a think about that. So back to your values that you wrote down in the beginning. In terms of your espoused values, what are your company values? So what are your lived values? So are they the same, or are there other values in play in your organization today? So when you think about your own organization today, okay, we got, how many values have you got for a start? Let me see, anyone higher than 5? Anyone higher than 6? 7? 8? 9? 10? 10 values. Okay, all right, okay, interesting. Okay, so without detouring too much, I just one point, when I came into Agile, we had 9 values, sorry. And one of the things I did first was to go out and ask people in the business, okay, what are our values? A bit like I'm doing now. And a lot of people could answer at least 5 of them, right? 5 out of 9. But not necessarily the same 5. I mean, some of them were the same, right? And it taught me the lesson that there is probably, from an organization bandwidth, a limitation to how much we can ask people to remember. Because if you can't recall the values, they can't really guide your decision making and your behavior, right? So I ensured that we work together to bring it down to 3. So three values. So that's not to say that you have to go out and go back and say, okay, we need 3 values, but just to say, the more values you have, the more complexity you potentially are creating, and the harder it is to recall and guide behavior, right? But back to this. Your company lives values. Are there values? And there may not be. I'm not suggesting there have to be. When you think about your experience in terms of how the organization operates, are there any other values at play? It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be none, but are there any other values in play? Just have a think about that. Talk to the person next to you and just think about your lived values. Are they 100% aligned to your espoused values, or are there other values in play? Okay. If you have identified there might be another value that is equally important as the espoused values, then just make a note of it, right? The second question I've got in relation to this is this. So if you look at your existing values, so the espoused values that you wrote down in the beginning, on a scale from 10, between 10 and 0, right? Where 10 is, the values are known, people they talk about them, and people they follow them in decision making and in their behaviors. That's a 10, right? Gold star. Versus the other end, people don't really know them, or they ignore them, or they don't follow them in their decision making and behaviors. Where would you put each of those values that you wrote down? Sorry for the guys, you've got 10 values, you've got a bit of work to be done here, but where would you, on a continuum between 10 and 0, where do you think you sit? So just write a little number next to each of your values in terms of where you see you're sitting. Obviously, the journey here is to close the gap, to close the gap between, obviously, if there is a gap between whether it's 0 and 10 or somewhere in between. But obviously, the journey is to ensure that people, they really know the values, that they talk about them, they're following the decision making and in their behavior. That's kind of the cultural trick to creating an operating culture, right? And that's often the hard part I find in my experience is how do we close that gap? Because when you start, I remember when I launched values into the Vodafone values, for instance, I created them from scratch, always through consultation and all of that. But to move from people knowing about it, to talk about it, to actually follow them for decision making and behaviors, that's not easy, right? It's not easy. It takes a while to be able to do that. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong as part of that. But just to say that when you think about your own values and your own culture in the organization you're with, always think it through the lens of espoused versus lived values in terms of from an operating culture perspective. That becomes important when we talk about toxic culture. Because toxic culture is, in my experience, is based on 2 fundamental things. Number 1, extreme self-orientation. I don't say self-orientation because self-orientation, so in the organization, in any organization, we have a self-orientation, you have self-orientation. It's okay to have self-orientation. We want something, right? We're there to get a collective paycheck. We have got aspirations around our career and so forth. But extreme self-orientation, right? That is when it's all about my needs at the expense of everyone else, right? So that's what that is, extreme self-orientation. And to hand in hand with that is self-preservation. So self-preservation is really where it's more important to preserve your own image or preserve your own safety. You know, that's the most important thing in terms of not to to take a risk or be seen to put yourself into a vulnerable position. So self-preservation is key, right? So a toxic culture start to come into play when often the espoused values we talked about before are actually replaced. You know, so in the N1 case, it was not about integrity; it was about arrogance, right? So something was actually replacing the official values, if you like, and they often centers around extreme self-orientation and self-preservation, right? They're the two key things to look out for. Now, how that manifests itself daily in the organization is through arrogance, just like in Enron's case, right? I know better, one-upmanship, my way, the highway. What do you know, right? All that stuff. Arrogance. Backstabbing. Okay, as soon as you left the room, bang, the dagger comes out. Gee, this person in finance, what a loser, right? So the daggers, they come out. Or front stabbing. I think you're a tosser, right? To people's face, right? I think you're a tosser, right? So, or sidestepping, and when it comes from all directions, right? So that's often kind of how it comes out, through arrogance, through backstabbing, front-stabbing, and sidestepping, or through submission. I mean, how many times have I heard like a CEO or senior manager say, I've asked them for their input, they say nothing. Yeah? Why? Because people don't feel it's safe, all right? So you had the chance, but you didn't say anything. No, because you haven't created the environment for people to feel safe to say what's on their mind, right? So you get this kind of submission culture where it's all based on risk aversion. So this is really where the toxicity starts to come out, right? And as I said in the beginning, it can come out in a team, department, in a division, or throughout the whole organization. Now, Enron, it was pretty rife, right? They had all of them running through their veins, contrary to the official values of the organization. So this can manifest itself very directly, or in terms of, as I said, where it's very visible, or more subtly, right? Backstabbing sometimes can be quite subtle, right? So why do cultures become toxic? And in my experience is a couple of things. Number one, there's this misplaced mindset at winning at all costs, right? So often we are brought up with this sense of, for me to get into the organization and being part of the organization, I have to win, and I seem to be winning at all costs, right? So whatever it takes, whatever it takes, the end justifies the mean. And and that we see in a lot of workplaces. I think it's been almost cultivated over a long period of time, whatever it takes, winning at all costs. So that's certainly one dynamic. The second dynamic is around unconsciously learned behaviors. So for instance, if you enter into an organization where there is this winning at all cost culture, then you're kind of entering into that environment and you try to think about, okay, how do I survive in that environment? So I try to replicate what I experience, right? But the other part of it is sometimes these behaviors, if you like, they come from that deep sense of fear and insecurity. When cultures, I'm just going to look at these two things I just mentioned around the learned behavior. This is a study that you see here that was done back in the late 1962, I think it was, where they basically put this, I guess, the test person into a lift and just to see what would happen to that particular person when people around that person were facing away from the door. They're just facing the wall, right? What would happen to the person, and what happened was that the person, in order to fit in, they quickly learned that for me to fit in, I have to face the wall like the rest of them, right? So this is a great example of kind of how a learned behavior, right? There's not really any reason. I mean, it's just mirroring, right? What's happening. So that's obviously one dynamic when we talk about toxic culture, is that if you're entering into an organization where this is the norm, there seems to be a tendency to just follow that particular norm, right? So that's the kind of number one. And when we think about what the definition of culture is, a culture is often referred to as the way we do things around here. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's very broad. I like to say is that it's actually the prevailing expectation that we follow around here. So what is the prevailing expectation? So an expectation is actually something that is either very overt or it may not be overt, but it's something that is very clear around there's an expectation of me to do something, right? So in this case, the expectation is that I turn around and face the wall, right? And a prevailing expectation to follow a certain behavior and mindset. So that's number one. That's the learned behavior and the mirroring of what's already happening. The other thing that I think I've seen is this thing about what we call the impostor syndrome, which drives a lot of, I think, the arrogance and some of those sort of the extreme self-orientation and the self-preservation that I mentioned before. And the imposter syndrome is basically based on that we often found psychologically that there is a tendency to think that I'm going to be found out. So my internal dialogue is that I may not be good enough. I might be a fraudster. So I'm just going to put on a front to project that I know what I'm doing, right? So this whole imposter syndrome is psychologically something that we've discovered in recent time is more and more important, particularly around leadership development, right? So particularly leaders who are very self-assured and very self-confident, when you actually get behind the veneer, often they're actually quite vulnerable in terms of, I just don't want to be found out, that I may not have the answer or I may not be good enough, right? So we keep this, we call it the mask, right? Where you put this mask on in terms of being extremely competent and confident, right? I'm really good at my job. And if you challenge me, then, I'm going to push back because I'm extremely good at my job, right? So this corporate mask that we're putting on of being really, really competent is all to do with this imposter syndrome. We don't want to be found out. And the more 360 work I've done over the years, the more we find out how actually this imposter syndrome is actually is permeating through organizations in terms of keeping up appearance of being perfect. So for those of you who've done OCI work or LSI work will know that the second mask, so what happens behind the imposter is this thing about I need to be perfect, fear of failure. I need to be smarter than my colleagues, right? Because I don't want to be seen not to be good enough. I need to demonstrate power and say I'm in charge, right? Because I don't want to be perceived as being powerless. I need to be liked because I don't want people not to like me, right? It's all based on fears about not being good enough, the fear of not being good enough, which ties back to this imposter kind of syndrome, if you like. And the amount of times I've seen, particularly with some of the most competent leaders, technically competent leaders, who've also had a profound negative impact on the organization because of their behaviors. If you can get them to the point where they actually get behind that mask and actually get to talk about what's behind it, right? The imposter syndrome, it opens up a whole new world for them and for the organization. All of a sudden you can unblock a whole department because one leader is starting to behave differently, right? But it's all based on those insecurities. So now the impact of this whole toxic culture is quite profound in my experience. First of all, because from a customer perspective, if you're in an environment where there is this whole extreme self-orientation and self-preservation, you're not really in the best possible space to deliver a good customer experience, right? Because it becomes more focused on your agenda than their agenda, right? You become very me-centric rather than other-centric. It also has a profound impact on innovation. I mean, these days you hear a lot about agile, design thinking and all that stuff. But imagine doing design thinking with someone if they shoot your ideas down when you do an empathy map with someone, right? Or I mean, you're not really going to get the benefit of actually having a brainstorm, for instance, as an example, because you're going to shoot each other's idea down. Or the other part of that is you're going to withhold information, right? I'm going to save my idea to last because that's going to be the best one, yeah? So withholding information, that's kind of another way of it. And it all impacts innovation because, or even if you've got open conflict in the organization between departments or within teams, it affects your speed to market and affects your quality of the ideas that's going to be produced, right? So there's a huge impact on innovation. And of course, people who are talented, they're not going to hang around, right? Why would you waste your time to hang around in that kind of environment unless it's an organization who only values the technical aspect of talent? Yeah. But probably the most disturbing part, I think, is mental health. Because in a toxic culture, and we see that more and more, and a lot of you know this, is this intersection between mental health that is kind of what is caused or exacerbated by the workplace versus what is something that the person is carrying with them as something intrinsic that is related to their own personal life, right? But what we do know is either way that if you've got a high degree of toxicity in a culture, like high levels of extreme self-orientation and high levels of self-preservation, you're also likely to have more mental health issues in the workplace, right? And that's obviously going to impact the organization as well negatively. So how do you then how do you survive in an environment where you have a toxic culture? Well, I've identified three sort of kind of strategies. You either adopt the toxicity or adapt slightly to the environment. Okay, so for instance, if there is this high degree of extreme self-orientation, you mirror that, right? You start to take on some of the same strategies, if you like, and become one of them, if you like, because that's how we operate. It's back to the man in the lift, right? If you really kind of have the internal kind of stamina and you can kind of, you have a lot of sort of self-confidence, if you like, you may be able to ignore and sort of say, I'm not going to do that. You know, the person over there might be a tosser in terms of how they treat their people. I'm not going to do that, right? So you're going to ignore that and you're going to try and explore a more constructive way of doing it. But it's hard when you are in an environment where the norm is to do the opposite, right? And of course, the third strategy is to kind of just try to remove yourself completely from it all and potentially leave the organization. So this is kind of trying to potentially just kind of complete withdrawal, either from the organization or altogether, or from other teams if you can. So they're kind of the three coping strategies that I've identified, throughout the years that I see people kind of can adopt, if you like. Which brings us to, okay, so that's all good, but how do you then change this? So what is it? I call it a cultural detox, right? It's a bit like our body, right? So we tend to eat a lot of stuff and drink perhaps a couple of too many glasses of wine every now and then, and we build up the toxins and so forth. And then we decide, normally around the January period, we need to do a detox or something like that, right? I do think that organizations probably need to do that as well, in terms of think about, do we actually need to take a bit of an organizational detox here, right? Sometimes it's quite evident because there might be open warfare in an organization or a department, high levels of conflict, so it demands that you do something. But sometimes it could just be a bit like you do a bit of an annual kind of detox check, if you like, in terms of, okay, let's just do the real deal check, right? So we're not living in la la land and kidding ourselves about our values, right? And so this is kind of what I call the cultural detox. The goal behind a cultural detox is to create psychological safety, yeah? Psychological safety, what does that mean? Well, it means, I've got a definition I'm going to show you in a second, but it obviously means that people are less likely to embrace or feel that there's an expectation they have to embrace a fear-driven response, i.e. extreme self-orientation or self-preservation, right? So the impostor syndrome, right? So how do you create an environment where people feel safe? But creating psychological safety is really about this. It's about really cultivate safety so interpersonal risk-taking can take place. So interpersonal risk-taking is really when you can kind of really employ yourself without fear, negative consequences that you're either going to kind of have some loss of your self-image, your status, or your career. In other words, you feel safe enough to actually go to challenge and without any repercussions, if you like, right? To speak your mind, and that's not necessarily easy to cultivate in an organization, but that's, in my mind, number one thing in terms of creating that interpersonal risk-taking. How do you help people to do this, to actually inquire, but also to invite challenge, right? Without actually having to feel that their interpersonal safety is at stake. So the first detox tip I often say is these pictures here. I see that a lot lately in terms of, well, we've got this cool warehouse setup environment. We've got scooters that we can go around in the office. We've got paid lunch, and we can bring the dog on Friday, right? Great culture, yeah? So I'm not dissing that, by the way, but I'm just saying, but that for me is not really culture, right? It's supportive elements, but that's not the essence. I mean, imagine if you had all these elements, but the people you work with were tossers, right? From the perspective they were not treating you well, right? It wouldn't matter at all, right, what you had. So I think sometimes we get too, and I think Google has a lot probably to answer for, because we got very besotted with the whole Google model when that first came out in terms of, they got all these things, they got scooters and all that, and I think that's kind of swayed the perspective. So I think we focus too much on engagement and not enough on culture. And they are two different things. So as I said before, culture is normally a slower burn, and it's focused on basically cultivating the right expectations for how, we behave constructively towards one another in order to deliver the best results for the customer and the organization, right? So it's about expectation sort of setting, management, and obviously that's the cultural aspect of it. Engagement is about how you make people feel about the organization, often in the here and now, right? So if I give everyone a pay rise tomorrow, you're going to feel good, right? Yeah, but it's going to wear off, right? Particularly if the person you work with is still a tosser and they still don't treat you well. So I'm not saying that engagement is not important anymore. I'm just saying I think we've gone too far down the path of engagement, and I think we need to get back to looking at cultivating culture more deliberately. So we're very clear on how do we create a constructive culture with the right expectations. So to do that, my detox tip number one is that you build in what I call a culture audit. And in terms of, we do that, I've done that. Every time we obviously do the integration in terms of mergers, if you like, of companies and so on, we often do obviously cultural audits where we look at what are the prevailing declared, espoused values, but also what are the lived values in the two organisations and where do we see a potential friction point. But I do, even if you're not a merger, I think it's good practice, perhaps annually or whatever works for the organisation, just to do a bit of a cultural audit and go back to where we started and say, okay, we have our values. Let's just do the sniff test here, right? The real deal test. To what extent is it actually lived throughout the organisation, right? So, do people know about our values? Do they talk about them? Yeah? Do they actually think about them in terms of their decision making and does it actually impact their behaviours? That's what we need to find out. Are there other values that are more important? So that's what a cultural audit is there to identify. So you can actually ritualize it. You can build it into your operating rhythm, either annually or whatever it works for the organisation. But I think just assume that just because we've got values in the induction and someone is proving it, then they're lived. I think that's too naive in my experience.
Can I just ask a question?
Yep.
So when you're finding out what business thinks, is that through managers having conversations with their people and coming back, or is that through some type of pulse survey, or how are you doing it?
In terms of the cultural audit? There's different ways you can do it. You can do a combination of obviously focus groups is one. That's certainly, I would definitely advise focus group is a good way to do it because you can get a bit more depth around it. You can also use a tool like the OCI because the OCI gives you a bit of an insight into obviously how people think about the culture, if you like, or you can come up with your own homegrown version, which is more focused on, as I said, the lived values, less focused on just the glitz and glamour, right? So perhaps some situational questions you can put in there around how people experience decision making, how people experience conflict and disagreement, etc. So it can be a combination of qualitative and quantitative. I think it's important to do these audits because that kind of knows your starting position around where you're at, right? So you kind of know what needs to potentially be looked at. And I think culture is the long game, right? Engagement is the short game, culture is the long game. As I mentioned before, it's easier to engage people. It's harder to change the culture in line with what you need. So that's detox tip number one. Now, number two, talk to the person next to you. There's a picture up on the wall with a policeman and another person, and they're both running. And I want you, the two of you, the person next to you, to agree on what's going on, right? With whatever context you've got. What's going on? So talk to the person next to you. What's going on? All right. And once again, log in an explanation with the person next to you. What's going on? Do we agree what's going on? No? Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask you, but in the interest of time, I'm going to share with you what this is about, right? Back in the 1960s as well, Scotland Yard were recruiting for new police officers. This is way before the whole notion around unconscious bias and all these fancy concepts were introduced. But one of the things they wanted to look at was what interpretation that the potential new recruits, what interpretation would they put to this particular picture? Because what they were looking for was racism, right? Because they were because the implied here was that this guy here, the police officer, is chasing this guy because he's a criminal. As a matter of fact, they're colleagues. They work together, and the potential suspect or criminal is outside of the picture frame and can't be seen, right? So, but the point of it was really, and where it becomes quite interesting from a detox perspective, is that I think it's important when you talk about organization culture is that you continue to educate the organization. Don't just think that often what I see is that we launch new culture values and then into the induction and then kind of just runs, right? I think you need to continuously educate the organization about what's going on. The second part, and that's really where it links more closely into the picture, is you need to provide context. Because without the context, people, they make their own decisions about what's going on, right? So you can see here, so in your own head, because I didn't give you any context for this particular picture, you were drawing your own conclusions, right? So being able to provide the context for what's going on in relation to the culture is so important. This is why we're doing X in relation to this particular behavior or this particular value in this organization. Provide the context. This is how it benefits me, you, the customer, and so forth. Very important. Number 2, check and challenge current stories. How many stories are floating around in the organization that are not necessarily sense-checked, right? So people have filled in the gaps. We're sense-making beings. You know, in absence, when you leave a vacuum, people will fill it. Yeah. And imagine if those stories are stories that are not necessarily helpful to the culture, right? Because culture is really a fabric, right? You buy into the culture and you buy into the stories of what's happening in the organization. So imagine if people have filled in these vacuums because you haven't created a context. So they make up their own stories about what's going on. I had a leader once who I spoke to, and he basically said to his team, guys, whatever you do, don't trust anyone. So I then spoke to him and said, okay, so because a couple of his people came and spoke to him and said, okay, so this is direction you're given to your team, right? Don't trust anyone. So tell me, how is this going to help you, right? Because of course he's scored an own goal, right? Because by saying this, obviously they're not going to trust him by definition, right? Because they're not going to trust anyone. So, and it's not going to help him, it's not going to help them, it's not going to help the organization overall. So providing the right context for why we're together, what we're here to do, what we need to achieve is so important. Detox number 3, and that really relates to the classic, the standard that you walk past is the standard you accept, right? So this is a classic. The meeting after the meeting, now let's tear everything apart. We tacitly supported just a few minutes ago. In other words, we have a meeting, then we walk out, and then we just ignore it or do something completely the opposite. So I think whenever you see a standard or walk past the standard in your organization and just accept it without addressing it, you're kind of condoning it, right? And it doesn't take a lot, particularly at more senior levels, a few times, and then all of a sudden say, okay, people are clued in, right? Sense-making beings. Okay, all right. So we got our values. Yeah, okay, I got them in induction, understand them, but this is how it really works, right? Okay, so it's all about speed. One of our values is speed. All right, okay. But I can see that my boss can rock in at 11 o'clock. Okay, so can I, right? Because we can take our time, right? So the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. I think is a key thing to think about in terms of what are potentially some of the things that we are accepting of at the moment just by not addressing it. So, and this is kind of, I call it create consequence with compassion. Because sometimes when people, they create consequence, they go in and all, you should have done this, blah, 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 and people get their backs up, right? But create consequence with compassion implies that you try to do it, in a compassionate way and actually try to highlight to the person if they're doing something that is not necessarily helpful to them or the organization, how it's actually going to help them and the organization by doing something differently. The thing you can't do is just ignore it, right, and hope it's going to go away. Detox number 3, right? Detox number 4, but the fourth detox tip, and that's probably the biggest, I have to say, that is, my mantra has always been, get your leaders right or get the right leaders. And what I mean by that is that so much of culture is created and shaped by the leaders of the organization at all levels. And there's no doubt that if you think about the biggest levers you have to eradicate toxicity in your organization. Then is to ensure that you have the right leaders. Now, your starting position may not be perfect, right? Because you've inherited whatever you have, and depending on what you do in the organization, you might not necessarily be in a position to influence directly and so forth. But I do think the opportunity to actually accelerate and eradicate, accelerate positive culture and eradicate toxicity in a culture often comes down to the right leaders. If we look at our leadership population, often you can think of one or two, perhaps even three people who say, oh, it's a bit countercultural, right, in the way that they operate. And the impact on the organization is massive, right? Or at least for their function of their teams. And it kind of, the same formula goes, obviously, there's a saying that is that leaders cast long shadows, particularly senior leaders, they cast long shadows. So obviously, the more senior you are, the longer your shadow. However, even if you are a leader in a team at a front line, it's the same principle, right? Because if you've got the wrong leader in the job, in terms of they're not right, in terms of actually they might be countercultural in terms of they might not really be aligned to the values of what you're trying to achieve, then you have to find a way to make them right. Yeah, that's normally what I say. It's back to this compassionate consequence. You try to help people to make it right. Coaching, training, awareness, all of that. However, and this is where it becomes interesting, if that doesn't work, you do need to make the tough call and get the right leaders in. And this is where a lot of organizations, they struggle, because it's not easy always, because you have to navigate a few different things. You have to navigate potentially politics, all of that stuff. But the lever, the number of times that this lever, when I pick this particular lever, the impact of the organization has been massive, particularly if you talk about senior leaders. But don't just think about this as senior leaders, as it is leaders at any level. So leaders are really your leverage point to the organization. So that's up the 4 detox team tips. That's probably the most important one. So if I summarize everything I've said in this little session, be very clear that there's a difference between espouse values and live values, right? The real deal. And understanding that, I think, is really important. And accept that we all have toxicity at various degrees in our culture. It's not you either have it or you don't. We have degrees of it. And the way it manifests itself is through those kind of the backstabbing, the front stabbing, and the side stabbing, or I call it the blame game, right? Or submission in terms of people not speaking up, right? Or withdrawing or not taking risks, right? Playing it safe, yeah? They're all manifestation of there are certain toxicity in the environment. So part of the journey is to create that psychological safety. And obviously use those 4 cultural detox tips that I just provided you with. But it's not easy. It is not easy. But that's kind of, in my experience, the way kind of to address that. So I'm going to finish off with one final quote, and that is, you are the culture. I often hear this, people almost talk about culture as something that is outside of themselves or the organization. I think the organization should do this. I always go back and say, okay, so where are you? Because you have an employee ID, so I assume, I've got one too, so I assume we're both part of it, right? Yeah. So I think reminding people that there's no such thing as cultural transformation. There's no such thing as cultural transformation without individual transformation. So if you, and this kind of you yourself, do not want to try to change, then it's very hard to get traction from a cultural perspective overall, right? And what it often comes down to, when you really look at it, in a very simple thing, is what makes you awesome is when you can start to kind of share the flaws, not the perfection, but the flaws in what's going on. And when you combine the two, you get flawsome, right? So if you want to be flawsome, right, then it's about thinking about, okay, what are some of the things perhaps we can let's be real around it, right? Let's not pretend. Sometimes I feel that this employer branding activity that's been going on has created this veneer of perfection so when you kind of scratch behind that veneer, then there kind of is an underbelly of all other stuff that hasn't kind of being talked about. So Dalai Lama's quote is, to be aware of a single shortcoming within oneself is more useful than be aware of 1,000 in somebody else. So actually, before you look out, look in. Yeah? And I think that's a good message to take out to well, first of all for yourself, but also to the leaders and to the teams, right? So we don't want to say it's just all about the leaders, because that's not the case, because personal leadership is equally important, right? And it's all about starting with yourself before you look the other way. That's how you get real traction around cultural change. That's it for me. Cheers.
Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Franck? While he's got the floor. We don't have to put on the podcast.
Did it make sense, guys? Yeah?
Yeah, but it's kind of just about buying, because you talk about the leaders and the
Yeah.
leaders, etc. So,
Yeah.
you know, how do you get the buy-in around this? You know, you talked about the audit, etc.
Yeah.
They might just go,
Yeah.
you know, we don't need that.
Yeah.
So what are some of the tips in terms of
Yeah.
buying?
Yeah, I mean, kind of look at, it depends on obviously where you're positioned in the organisation and your influence channels that you've got. This is the red one. Look, I found that different strategies can apply. Obviously, I'm not sure whether, are you in the HR team yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, one option is to really present them to a kind of a safer audience. You know, often whoever. Are you the one heading up HR or yeah? So talk to yourself. No. So but yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure you exhausted that avenue first, right? Okay. So that's tick. We've done that one. But otherwise, I mean, so I would then assume you are in a position to actually be able to influence, right? So then I think it's really just do a simple stakeholder map in terms of who are the key people that I need to get on board, right? And I was talking to an organisation last week where I came in and they had, our CEO, he's not on board, right? That's a challenging thing. So that was the HR director I spoke to, and I said to her, like, look, you can't push this stuff, right? It's a bit like whatever. If you push one way, you get a stronger push the other way. So you kind of have to kind of cultivate there's the old saying, but it's that the student will arrive when the teacher is. The student will arrive when the teacher will arrive when the student is ready, right? So I think creating that readiness, I think it will be important. So team up with some of the key people that are around you, and actually arm them with some of the key information, right? So, but don't say it comes from you. Just sort of say, like, put it into their own words. I mean, assume that they think it's a great idea, right? So, and perhaps just so the CEO in this case, if it's the person that needs to be influenced, they get it from a number of different people, particularly not because sometimes it comes from HR. Oh, it's just HR, right? So you kind of need to get allies from within the business. This is kind of, I mean, it's not quite Game of Thrones here, but you do kind of have to accept that there is an existing operating model in play or structure in play that you need to kind of leverage for the good, not the bad, right? And so I think that will be an important thing in terms of really think about who are the key stakeholders. So for this person, this HR director I spoke to, the CTO became kind of the other person that we engage in a conversation, because he was very passionate about the cultural that needs to change and so forth as well. So there's two, and then they're trying to get a third one in. So they're trying to try to get a few different people in play. But similarly, it could also be depending on this, if it's the CEO that is the blockage, in terms of get some case studies in, get some other people to come in, other organisations who've been on the journey, get a CEO to come in, equal level. There's a lot of things you can do. Sorry.
How do we deal with the issue of scapegoating in a toxic culture? I mean, I've observed that in a few places where people are aware of the need for change and may not be completely on board, but then come to the realisation that want to sort of shift responsibility for that to others. How do you manage that sort of?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the blame game I talked about before, where you start to do the front-stabbing, back-stabbing and side-stabbing, right? So the blame game is, I mean, in my mind, any organisation, I mean, if I was to think about what's really key in any organisation, it is to try to get that personal accountability, right? Because if you can cultivate personal accountability, then it becomes less about what other people are doing and more about what you can do, right? So I think what I've found in my experience is often when people, and you can hear it in people's language in terms of how they frame it up, you know. So if it's framed up as these people or them, or so language around that, then I think the opportunity is in terms of bringing it back to you, right? So, okay, what can you do to actually make a positive contribution, irrespective of what has been happening, right? So, or depending on how bad the blame is, I mean, so if it's derogatory, obviously call it, right? So that's back to the standard you walk past, So, yeah.
It's pretty much a cycle thing because what he said last week, I was in a conversation. I'm a HR business partner, and I was just in a conversation with an employee, and it wasn't the first time I hear from different people. Oh, this place is always like this, and it's never gonna change. And they doing this, they doing that, and I said, okay, so what are you prepared to do to change that? And they said, oh, HR doesn't do anything, or nobody does anything. So I said, okay, so what would you like me to do? Oh, I don't know. I said, would like to have a conversation? Oh no, I don't want to be part of the solution. So it becomes that if there is a perception that nobody does anything, but it needs to be someone else because normally in general people don't want to be the ones addressing the problem or taking the steps to change. I was like, okay, it's always been like that and people do this, people do that. So how this is going to change if nobody's prepared to do something like that?
I mean, look, it's so in actually we call it the mindset of the victim, and the mindset of the victim is exactly like that, right? It's everything has happened to me, you're the one doing it, right? So the mindset of the victim is predicated on everyone else is not doing the right thing. I'm hard done by. I'm entitled to X, Y, and Z. I mean, so whatever happens is nothing to do with me. I'm the victim here, right? So cultivating, and it goes back to your question around personal accountability as well, it's the essence of a cultural shift is to actually go in and address that. But it's hard. It is bloody hard because if it's permeating through exactly. So what we did with that show was we actually deliberately introduced a mindset opposite to the victim mindset, and we called it the player mindset. And the player mindset was basically based on how can you show up with a team player mindset, not with a victim mindset. Now that was the shorthand of it, but it's the same. It's the same in any organisation that we work for. It comes back to the toxicity around the way people they think in terms of extreme self-orientation. It's all about me. Because you guys are not doing your job, or all that stuff, right? So there's not in the short term. So there's you can think of it in two ways. You can think of it in the here and now, the person in front of me, or you can think a bit more strategically around longer term. So what's in front of you may be hard to. I mean, you can try to control the conversation in terms of so what I often do is I say, okay, all right, let's just ring fence everyone else, right? So we cannot talk about any of those people. Let's just talk about you and your contribution, right? You're the one who has a problem. You're the one who's suffering. Okay, what can you do to change? So keep it.
That's what I said to him, because this is the only thing you have control over. Is
Yeah.
What you can do.
Yeah.
What everyone else
Yeah.
is doing is kind of out of
Yeah.
control.
Yeah.
You have control of what you can do.
Yes. No, absolutely. So that's the best you can do there. And then what I've also sometimes used with people is basically like in terms of depending on how hard they go on the organisation, it's back to what I mentioned before, is that you are the organisation, right? Yeah. So you can't put yourself out of the organisation. I mean, it's not like we share the same kind of destiny here, right?
It was interesting because it was like, the culture in this place, the culture in
Yeah.
this place. Okay,
Yeah.
so when you're talking about the culture of this place, we are the culture
No.
of this
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like we are the ones making this way, and if you go like, because people left us like, the things that those people told would be the culture. It continues to permeate in how people think.
Yeah.
The culture.
But then it
That's right.
depends on how he reacts as well. Like
Yeah.
when you meet him.
And
And
yeah.
I said at that time, you can only work on that situation.
Yeah, that's why I'm
Go
saying.
back and think about it.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying.
It's long, like when you're talking about that.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. You can work on it like here and now, and what's in front of you. You can work on it strategically, right? Culturally, if you work on the culture, you work strategically on cultivating a mindset of accountability. That's what you're doing.
And it's interesting how they just said HR is doing nothing. Like, HR doesn't drive the culture. I think
No.
it comes from the exec, and HR helps the exec drive the
It's funny, it's interesting you say that. So I've actually moved away from using culture, so altogether, associated with HR for that reason. Because yeah. So my title with Agile was People and Performance Director. I didn't want culture in there because for that reason, right? Because there is the risk that culture is being seen as HR's responsibility, and so it is quite interesting from that perspective. I agree. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, look, that was exactly the point I was
Yeah.
going to make. Given how powerful language is,
Yeah.
I think the shift away from human resources
Yeah.
as a term doesn't bother me because
Yeah.
I think just referring to people as resources is
Yeah.
the best thing. But this whole shift to people and culture
Yeah.
has really bothered me a lot
Yeah.
because I was in a people and culture
Yeah.
role, and I found the minute that it became that, suddenly there was this focus
Yeah.
on, oh, it's yours.
Yeah.
It's like, actually, it's ours.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we need to
Yeah.
work on this.
Together.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
And one person doesn't make the
no,
culture.
using people and performance
Yeah.
is a far better way
I
of
think-
expressing what we're about.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my experience, there's that point around not tying culture into HR directly. The other part, I think, is to. I always make the point you cannot outsource culture, right? So some organisations think we can bring in a consultant and they can fix the culture, but you can't, right? So you have to work in a partnership with external providers, but you have to be in the driver's seat of the culture that you're trying to create, right? So partnership is okay, but you can't outsource the responsibility. It's
And I think the execs have to be part of that full 360 review.
Yep.
And go, people view you this
Yeah.
way, and you go, and I've worked with execs where they go, I'm not like that at all. Well, 3 different people have actually said that.
Yeah.
I'm not making this up. This is
Yeah.
how you're perceived
Yeah.
in the workplace.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's back to the leadership point I was trying to make around, sometimes, and that's why I call it like compassionate consequence, right? Because you have to have some compassion. I mean, people are not going to be perfect, right? And there are going to be stuff ups along the way and so on. So it's not like, hey, culture police, you didn't do the right thing. You kind of have to use common sense here, right? So, and be compassionate and support people. But at the same time, if there are clear guidelines that are being overstepped and you provided ample of opportunity for support and awareness and so forth, you also have to make the call on particular leaders, but it applies to anyone, but particular leaders because they carry that longer, or that shadow that I talked about before, right? So the longer you're not doing anything, you're just condoning it.
What are your thoughts on including culture, and I will put engagement in this as well, in KPIs, in exec KPIs in particular?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, there's obviously there's the logic around what get measured gets done, and I think it depends on the organisation and how it's set up, because I've got a few friends who work, for instance, in the banking industry, right? So they always say whatever the KPIs is based on, that's what gets attention, right? So it may be worth trying that out and see whether that will actually gotta make a difference, But I still think you can't just put a KPI on. You still have to create the awareness, because culture is like, I call it, it's the soft stuff that makes a hard difference, right? And sometimes it's hard to people to grasp it. How do I start? Where do I start? What do I do, right? So it's kind of the input side that delivers the output side, So Peter Drucker used to say that, what does he say? A culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Now I actually think leadership eats culture for breakfast, right? So that's kind of my add-on, if you like. But I do think that if you don't create the awareness around what people they need to do, it'll be hard for them to know how to impact that particular KPI. So I would say you can experiment with it, but I think you have to have a very good front end around education and explanation around just chucking a KPI.
The organization we were having this discussion, kind of talk about having KPIs and stuff, and they always talk about people and culture, which is what's called there.
Yep.
Having KPIs around engagement and around turnover. And I am always the first one to say, happy with that, as long as it's in also all the leadership team.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because we cannot be alone
Yeah.
responsible for
No.
this in the whole organization. So
Yeah.
I do think think it's a good idea to have a KPI so that
Yeah.
everyone gets done.
Yeah.
But it needs to be something
Yeah.
cascaded down and part of everyone.
Yeah.
It's the same as doing an engagement survey and having like, oh, you need the increase,
Yeah.
the, you know,
Yeah.
results. Just HR or
Yeah.
whatever you name.
Yeah.
No, it needs to be in everyone.
Yeah.
And I work in
No,
an
I agree.
organisation
Yeah.
that It was in
Yeah.
everyone's, every manager's or leader's
Yeah.
KPIs to have that increase as well.
Yeah.
They are the ones driving, making sure the other things are being
Yeah. Yeah.
everything's being done and you're following up on the
Yeah.
feedback that's being received.
Yeah, I mean, it's back to the point that it has to, you can't just say like balance scorecard, okay, the people part, HR, right? I mean, that will be counterintuitive. You have to have it dispersed throughout the business. Everyone has to have a responsibility around engagement or culture, absolutely. Yeah, so.
What's your advice? I work for the parent company, we've got several subsidiaries.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with the GM today about something specific to his business, and I'm trying to look at the umbrella over him, and I said, I think we need to do it. He's like, I don't care about that, only my KPIs are about my business, and I need to deliver just on my business.
Yeah.
That kind of narrow-minded view, which I get it, because he only is the GM of that business, but I'm trying to do everyone needs to operate the same way.
Mm-hmm.
What's your advice on getting through to him that he's part of the bigger picture?
Look, it's an interesting one. So one of the things I've done in the past is, I mean, I've introduced the concept of what I call two-hat thinking. Because everyone, when we, particularly leaders, when they get into a business, they think, what's in front of me, right? What's in front of me? You know, so what's in front of me is my team or my department. So that's the hat I will be wearing, right? And I'm going to fight for you guys to get whatever you want, right? Because that's the hat that I'm wearing. And there's definitely, there can be certain systemic drivers like incentives and so on. But I would also think that if you think about leadership on the maturity curve, I would say leaders who are on the kind of lower end of the maturity scale, they just think about themselves, right? It's high self-orientation, right? And then you go through various, and then you work your way up, right? And then leaders who can think about, okay, I need to wear at least two hats here, right? I need to, perhaps even more, but at least two, right? I need to think about what's best for my team and me, but what's also best for the business. And that's a different step in the maturity kind of scale, if you like. Now, to get to that point, you're not just going to get that through a conversation. I mean, you can try, but it's going to be hard. You have to once again strategically work to cultivate that way of thinking in the organisation. Yeah.
I've had lots of complaints from his direct reports.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to help him, but he is sales focused because he's a sales manager.
Yeah.
He's been promoted to a GM.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the classic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because there was no one else and they
Yeah.
needed somebody.
Yeah, I mean, two issues. The two biggest issues around leadership often is number one is expertise. If people are really good at what they do as an individual contributor, that's a big challenge sometimes when they become leaders, right? Because they're really good at their job as individual contributors, and then they come into the job of leading people, and they can't transition into actually, yeah. Oh yeah, so they can't transition from being individual contributor to being a leader. Absolutely different mindset, different skill set than going out and actually chasing the dollars and get them in the door. So that's number one. Number two, I think, is the fact that you, and that's more organizationally, I think, and that's the hard part. I mean, we see often is that how much do you kind of almost condone or accept that some of your high performers might carry a bit of baggage in the way that they might getting results, but in that process of getting results, they're burning the village, right? And so organisationally, that becomes the question, and that's kind of back to what I said before in terms of at what point do you go on and sort of say, okay, look, he may or she may be our best performer in terms of absolute numbers, but there's a secondary impact here that is bigger, right? We've got people leaving us left, right, and centre, right? We've got people in other departments that are not performing to their maximum potential because they can't work with this particular individual. So the knock-on effect, above and beyond the individual contribution, that effect is actually bigger. It weighs out, yeah. Apparently Graham Ma, I don't know, I wasn't around, but I've heard that he's the previous CEO from Vodafone in the early days. I've heard that he used a very simple logic and say, I always fire people. I mean, that sounds a bit harsh on values, right? So if they don't display the values in terms of the organisation, I'll fire them, irrespective of how good they are, right? That's a pretty brave call if that was the case. I wasn't around, but that's what I've heard. So I think it comes down to the organisational tolerance, right? Because this person won't change.
No.
Why should he? What's the...
Look, we all report to the CEO, and I've said to the CEO,
Yeah.
this is my experience, this is what I've feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, this guy gets the numbers.
Yeah.
He brings in the money.
Yeah.
End of conversation.
Yeah. And this becomes really often a culture killer as well, because, you know, in terms of because really what you're saying, okay, we've got our values on the induction, but then we carry this tosser, right, who is just nuking everything, right? Yeah.
And we've got the revenue that they're making.
Sorry?
We've got the revenue that they're making.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in isolation potentially as well, right? And the other thing is sometimes, what I've seen this as well, is sometimes some leaders who are operating in this kind of toxic mindset, they like to make themselves indispensable, right? So they try to build up their own power base around information and relationship and so on. So in other words, they're making the business case for themselves so they can stay, right? Or make it hard for you to fire them, right? So I would de-risk that person would be my other advice. Find a way to de-risk. Yeah. So get that succession plan in place straight away, right? Yeah.
The other question I've got is if you're looking at a situation where potentially you know that there may be other people who do need to move on in order for the culture to shift, and it does create a spike internally. And I'm going back to my own experience where in a number of organisations where sometimes the finance team will go, oh, a lot of people are coming and going, and we need to stop that. And I can understand that thinking, but if your longer term goal is about creating a culture of whatever it is, and that turnover needs to spike in order for you to be able to bring things, providing you've given people the opportunity to train, you've given people know what it is you're trying to achieve, they've got an opportunity to opt in or opt out, and they choose to opt out. And that creates that spike in turnover. I know from my own experience that can create challenges within organisations. How do you deal with a situation like that?
Oh, look, I think I mentioned before that culture is a long game, not a short game, right? So what I mean by that is not just engagement, but potentially also attrition, right? So you kind of have to accept that sometimes that you have to carry certain losses for a period of time in order for you to rebuild, or you know. So that's part of it, I think. And often what I found is that we're fearful of, you know, upsetting the system, right? So we're not being brave enough to actually make the tough decision, perhaps absorb a bit of hardship. I mean, the classic one is that if you have to get rid of someone because they are, back to the scenario I had before, and then they leave a gap, right? Because there's no one else, because they had all the information, they had all the relationship with customers and so on. Oh, so we're not going to do it, right? But so you have to think, we're going to do it, and then we're going to find a way to navigate through, right? It's about being brave around some of this particular stuff.
But then how often do we go through that and have to deal with the fact that, only this person can do it, and they do go, and we discover that actually there are other people who are more happy to actually make it work.
I mean, my biggest lessons over the years have been that no one is indispensable. You know, and I think that's how you should set up the organisation as well. I mean, no one should be, you know, irreplaceable, right? So, and not because it's bad, but just because at least that way organisations, it's a two-hat, right? You know, so wearing that hat around, okay, how do we de-risk the organisation? And you do that by ensuring that no one have their own little Machiavellian kingdom that they are operating in. Okay.